I'm Josh, and on today's episode of the Infographics Show, we're revealing the most terrifying military experiences with the paranormal, Part 2. The Graveyard Shift. It was just another day at the office for one American Marine stationed as a guard at the Beirut Bombing Memorial. He was performing a midnight patrol alone in the part of the cemetery dedicated to fallen veterans. He hadn't thought much about it. The quiet silence of walking among the graves in the dead of night felt like a welcome break from the chaos of war. But that was all about to change. The Marine was patrolling the perimeter around the part of the cemetery where the oldest headstones waited, the part of the cemetery most rarely visited even during the day. It was here that the Marine heard a woman humming an eerily calm tune. A feeling of unease gripped the Marine. Despite this, he did his duty and pushed on to investigate. As the humming got louder, he became aware of a faint light glowing through the gloom of the cemetery. The light shone through the branches and the leaves of a tree, and the closer he got, the more the Marine felt genuinely physical effects from the presence in the cemetery. His skin began to prickle, his hair started to stand on end. Overcoming his fear, the Marine passed through the branches only to see what must have been the oldest headstone he had ever seen. The names had been worn off by the marching procession of time, but the large cross cut into the gravestone was glowing a brilliant neon blue, and the humming was even louder. It sounded like hundreds of voices layered together, all of them rising from that dazzling blue cross. The Marine did what anyone would do. He ran, and by his own admission, screamed like a little girl. He radioed the Marine scheduled to take over his shift, calling for backup, which arrived quickly. The two spent the rest of the night huddled in the 2nd Marine's truck, neither willing to risk stepping back into the cemetery. Not knowing what had been out there, he decided to investigate the next day in broad daylight and found nothing amiss. Just a regular old headstone with no humming sound and no logical place that a glowing blue light could have come from. If it had been a prank, which he seriously doubted, an armed Marine would have been a brave target. To this day, he has no rational explanation for what he saw that night. He describes himself as a skeptic, but he firmly believes he encountered something beyond human understanding. But the Marine has at least gone on record saying that he believes the thing he encountered wasn't an evil force. Our next serviceman in paranormal peril cannot say the same. The Screamer. In the late 1970s, after completing a tour in Vietnam, an American soldier was stationed at the United States Air Force Base in Greenland. A cushy gig compared to getting shot at by the VC in sweltering jungles for months on end. But he had no idea that he was about to encounter something that couldn't possibly be explained. In Greenland, the biggest enemy was often the environment itself. The guys stationed at the base regularly needed to batten down for intense whiteout blizzards that rocked the buildings. And as the brass prepared the base for one of Greenland's brutal winter storms, they conducted roll calls and tied everyone to the compound with thick ropes, ensuring no one got lost in the blinding snow. It was a rule written in blood. Before this, personnel had wandered off and died alone, frozen, sometimes less than 65 feet from the base. And according to the soldier, around every 5 months during one of those blizzards, the base would receive a visitor. They'd always know it was there by the sound alone. Short, sharp, blood-curdling shrieks, like the sound of death itself drifting across the ice. But the Screamer also had other ways of making itself known. Every time the base received a visit from the Screamer, the engine room would be totaled. Smashed equipment, tools strewn around, paperwork confettied. Were they falling victim to the attacks of some polar poltergeist? Nobody wanted to be the one to check, given how dangerous blizzard conditions already were. But this wasn't just the wind or a curious polar bear. Whatever the Screamer was, it was capable of incredible feats of strength, able to lift a plain engine block weighing thousands of pounds off of a crane and hurl it several feet, obliterating everything in its path. Cameras and spotlights surrounded the perimeter of the engine room, yet despite all the surveillance and equipment, no human or animal was ever spotted entering or leaving the building during the Screamer's attacks. Then one day, it just stopped. What really happened? No one knows, and for all we know, the Screamer is still out there roaming the frozen wilds. But that haunted base seems downright chill compared to our next one. The Cursed Complex. As a drill sergeant for the Marines in Taiwan, our next military man thought that he had seen it all. That was until he was stationed at a base rumored to be built on or near a mass grave from a previous conflict. And it was there he would learn the true meaning of terror. In one of the stranger stories, he found one recruit in a state of clear dismay. The greenhorn had been put on night duty where he'd been overseeing the firing range, full of wooden and clay targets made to look like enemies pointing rifles at the training soldiers. According to the guard, he had been sitting around, bored out of his mind, keeping watch over the range the night before. Then, right before his eyes, one of the clay statues lowered its rifle and said, "Damn, I'm tired." He was so shocked that he passed out on the spot. Weird little paranormal moments like that were common. More common than the writers stealing all the coffee creamer here at Infographics HQ. But the drill sergeant experienced some of the eeriest paranormal events firsthand. One night, he was out doing his hobby of recreational snake hunting, prowling through the nearby fields with a long, sharp stick. As night fell, he turned on his flashlight just to make sure that the scaly enemies couldn't get a jump on him. However, as he approached the outhouse on the edge of the field, he noticed something odd. His flashlight would flicker off any time the beam shone at the outhouse. At first, he just thought it was a battery issue, removing them, shaking them, and putting them back in. Nothing seemed to work until he turned away from the outhouse, and then the lights worked fine. He turned back again, and just like that, the light went out. An ominous feeling was beginning to settle over the drill sergeant. There was something here, something powerful, and he was intruding on its territory. A man so mean that he went hunting for snakes with a stick, made a humble apology to whatever force was lurking near the outhouse, and then he left without looking back. Once, one of the recruits disappeared from the base. At first, the higher-ups assumed it was a case of desertion, in which case he'd be in a whole mess of trouble when they found him. The base was surrounded by mountains and trees, so a search party was sent out to see if the AWOL soldier could be found. A huge storm hit that night, and the team was forced to retreat before resuming their search the next morning. It didn't take long for them to find the recruit. He was crouching in a nearby cave, seemingly driven insane with terror, babbling incoherently. He offered no resistance when he was taken back to the base. The drill sergeant never learned what the missing recruit had seen that night, and he was shipped off soon after. Could it have been the same force that he'd encountered near the outhouse? It's a question that he'd never have an answer to. But not all the forces working on that mountain were the forces of darkness, it seemed. Once, the base and its surrounding area were hit by a powerful typhoon, not uncommon in Taiwan. Personnel at the base were sent out to assess the damage, and they found that the winds had been so strong they had uprooted a nearby tree. Strangely, though, the Buddhist shrine sitting at the base of the tree was untouched, its red ribbons and delicate offerings still perfectly in place. It seemed almost like that base was stationed on a mountain where the forces of good and evil itself were at war, and every so often that war would have a human casualty. But there is nothing human about what we'll encounter next: the goat people and the little men. Not everyone in an active war zone is a soldier working out of national duty. There are just as many soldiers of fortune serving as private security in the war-torn deserts of the world. One of those private military contractors was working night security when he noticed a strange shape moving over the mountains. So he decided to take a closer look through his binoculars. It was a herd of goats being shepherded across the plains. Not an uncommon sight out here, but then he got a closer look at the shepherds. They were dressed in strange burlap robes, hunched over, moving in a strange, unnatural gait, like something not quite human, just pretending to be. The contractor called over some of his buddies to look at these unnatural shepherds, nicknamed the Goat People. Every single one of them got the strangest impression that what they were seeing couldn't be human. The goats and the Goat People moved on soon after that, and they were never seen again. It's not uncommon, as it turns out, for American servicemen to encounter strange humanoid creatures while operating in Afghanistan. One drill sergeant had a much closer encounter with his own paranormal creature when he was trying to get some rest during a field mission out in the desert. While he was sleeping, he'd felt something rubbing up against his feet, causing him to jolt awake. Nothing could have prepared him for what he saw. A strange, skinny humanoid creature that he compared to Gollum from The Lord of the Rings was nibbling on his toes. He panicked and kicked at the creature, which spooked it and caused it to skitter away at incredible speeds. He'd never seen anything like it, and for a time he assumed that it was just some bizarre dream or a false memory. Until a few days later, when he heard another guy on the watch freaking out and pointing into the distance while staring through his binoculars. The drill sergeant took the binoculars and looked through them, only to see a freakish, skinny humanoid just like the one he'd encountered before crawling across the top of a stone wall. Still, you'd probably rather face the Goat People or the foot fetish humanoids than take your chances being stationed on the Carrier of the Dead. People involved in the military will often end up in places that regular civilians will likely never tread, and experience supernatural happenings that most of us will never have to worry about. And that's exactly what happened to one Navy man who was stationed on an aircraft carrier that was first commissioned back in 1977. One that had a reputation for eerie and sometimes even impossible events unfolding in the dead of night. One experience involved a night patrol covering multiple levels of the carrier, which meant traversing huge distances at night, often in total darkness. Their footsteps would echo down empty hallways and clang against the metal grates of the stairs. The patrolman was grabbing a rifle from the armory on the first deck and then traveling to the 04 level, alone. One story below the flight deck, in a part of the carrier that was pitch black, he suddenly heard footsteps not far behind him. Naturally, he turned to take a look, rifle clasped in a white-knuckle grip, but there was nobody there. Spooked, he decided to pick up the pace, until out of the silence he heard the footsteps clanking on the metal, a little further back this time. He turned to look and saw that about 30 feet behind him there was a dark figure standing completely still. That made him just about fill his standard issue pants, so he turned and booked it down the hall, only to feel his heart rate spike when he heard the footsteps speed up behind him, getting closer and closer. At last, he reached the stairs to the flight deck. Up there, other sailors were waiting, and he breathlessly told his terrifying story to them. Everyone avoided that level after that. But the crazy thing is that it wasn't even the only haunted level on this cursed carrier. Stories had long circulated about level 07, which was used to store munitions. It was said that this level had been the site of a tragedy. A young girl on a tour of the carrier had accidentally fallen to her death here. Everyone who has ever had to guard this level has said that if you lose focus, her ghost will rattle chains to get your attention again. And she is just one of the many ghosts that people report across the vessel. On the ship's fantail, an area on the back of the ship overlooking the water, sailors have reported hearing the giggling of a young girl and a ball bouncing off the edge into the water. And in a case that would definitely ruin our lives if it happened to us, it's said that if you doze off on the fantail, the ghost of a man in his Navy dress uniform will tap you on the shoulder and say the words, "Don't report this," and leap into the icy waters below. It's enough to make you want to stay away from the water for life. But our next real account of the paranormal can show you that sometimes the scariest things of all are waiting for you right here on dry land. Something hungry in the dark. It began at a base in Fort Carson, Colorado back in 2015. The soldiers were out in the field on an exercise near the woods, delayed because someone had lost an expensive pair of night vision goggles. The soldiers wanted to get out of there for many reasons, but one of the many is that they had run out of smokes and they were desperately wanting a nicotine hit. They decided it'd be worth a little excursion in order to get their fix, having no idea that it would put them all in the crosshairs of something terrifying. It didn't seem like they had much to be worried about. No insurgents were going to ambush them in the middle of Colorado. They all had weapons, body armor, and night vision equipment. Never in the history of the US military had a less risky operation been conducted, or at least that is what they thought. They crossed a stream in the valley they were stationed in and started to smell the rot. It was a smell so vile and intense that it could bring you to the edge of vomiting. Not a skunk, but the unmistakable stench of putrefaction, rotting meat. But the boys were really jonesing for that nicotine, so they pushed through, writing off the smell as the carcass of a dead deer that they somehow just missed. Then the feeling began to set in. As many of the soldiers in the group were experienced hunters, they were familiar with the feeling of stalking prey and of being watched. They felt eyes on them out in the dark, something with ill intent following them just beyond the range of what they could see. One soldier in the rear of the group decided to take a look back, and that's when he saw a pair of what looked like glowing eyes staring at them from the dark. They didn't stay there for long, and to this day nobody knows what the eyes in the dark and the terrible rotting smell belonged to. But if it could make a group of experienced soldiers feel like prey, then it's safe to say it's not something that you'd ever want to run into. Sometimes the scariest thing of all is the unknown, the unanswered question that lingers with you. Like, will Mr. Infographics ever let us write about something that isn't steeped in abject horror or despair? And these next troops know the feeling of dread. The sound outside. American servicemen stationed at the Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa in the early 2000s were confused when an emergency siren blared across the camp. All personnel on the base were to report immediately to the mess hall. This wasn't standard procedure, but everyone followed orders. When they arrived, they were shocked to see the base's entire staff, including the commanders, and they were taking the roll of everyone who entered the hall. Soon enough, it seemed like the entire base was there, at which point the commander told them all not to worry. They were all just taking a little break, and work would resume shortly. There were mixed messages here, as soldiers armed with assault rifles stepped in last and closed the various doors behind them. Everyone was locked inside with the implicit threat of live gunfire if anyone decided to run. Moments later, the entire mess hall was rocked by the sound of the loudest engine that anyone there had ever heard. It was so loud and so powerful that it made framed photos and trophies fall off the walls. The island seemed to shake as something landed outside, and then the engine stopped. Everyone was told to remain seated, and they were kept in the mess hall for about an hour before that same engine roar started again and the plane took off. The base commander told the assembled staff that the break was over, but officially it never even happened. They were forbidden to talk about it to anyone. Just a piece of classified military technology, or something far stranger, maybe even out of this world. We'll likely never know, and if you value your safety, you probably shouldn't look too deeply into the matter either. But the American military doesn't have a monopoly on mysterious flying anomalies either. This video might be about the paranormal, but don't ghost us. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe. The paranormal doesn't rest, and neither should your notifications. Anyway, next encounter, and lucky us, it's one of the freakiest ones yet. A UFO in Kosovo. This one comes to us courtesy of a group of straight-laced soldiers from the Bundeswehr, aka the German Army. A junior NCO and his colleagues were taking a drive near the Prizren airfield in Kosovo when they encountered something that defied all explanation. They suddenly saw a bright light glowing behind a small hill and worried that they might be seeing the aftermath of a plane crash. They decided to investigate in case anyone needed help. They got out of their vehicle and began to climb the hill until they heard a loud noise that the NCO compared to an electrical transformer at a substation. This was no plane crash. It was so much stranger. There was a craft unlike anything they'd ever seen, landed in a forested area. It was dome-shaped, silver, with 4 long insect-like legs emerging from the sides like some kind of landing gear. The bright glow they'd seen before was coming from the inside of the craft, but it wasn't just the alien craft that drew the eye. Members of the crew, long humanoid beings in tight-fitting suits, seemed to be operating unfamiliar devices and taking plant samples. Naturally, during all this, the soldiers were frozen watching it all play out. Soon, the entities got back inside the craft and flew away at incredible speeds. Shortly after that, the soldiers began to feel tired, sick, and disoriented. Next thing they knew, they were waking up 2 hours later staring at the starry sky above. They only ever told this to friends, worrying that if they reported it officially, they'd become a laughingstock, or worse, be deemed mentally unfit to serve. But if this video has taught us anything so far, it's that there are a lot of things out there beyond our understanding. And the strangest and most terrifying ones are still to come. The Lurker in the Dorm. This one wins the prize for being so eerie that it even had our emotionally dead writer looking over their shoulder while researching it, which is a real achievement given how many pictures of cartel executions they've had to see on the job. Our terrifying tale takes us back to another American military base in Japan, where spooky things always seem to be unfolding. But this one wasn't taking place in some spooky old building or a cursed, abandoned Shinto shrine. These were nice new dorms, where every room had its own private ensuite bathroom. But for one serviceman, this space would be anything but comforting. It began, as most great stories do, with him sitting on the toilet with the door open, a rare privilege in the military for people who get their own bathrooms. While he was doing his business, he suddenly got a strange feeling. He looked toward the door leading off of his bedroom, and that is when everything changed. There was a figure standing there, though he could only make it out for a fraction of a second before it darted away from view. He made out a pale face and what seemed like dark hair. When his time on the porcelain throne concluded, he carefully got up and crept into his bedroom, where he checked around as much as he could and found absolutely nothing. Maybe it'd just been his mind playing tricks on him. Still, he was cautious about his bedroom after that and decided to sleep in the recliner in his living room. Things went back to normal after that, spending his nights in his bedroom again, until a few days later when he was in his bathroom yet again and saw that same pale, dark-haired figure staring around the side of the door, watching, before darting off into the bedroom. After that, he decided his bedroom was off limits, and he slept in his recliner in the living room for 8 months until his deployment came to an end. All things considered, we really can't say that we blame him. But at least the mysterious watcher haunting his bedroom wasn't actively trying to hurt him. We can't say the same for the next paranormal encounter we've unearthed. Just Jinn time. For a change of pace, this time we're following a combat medic with the U.S. Army deployed in Iraq in 2006. She was granted emergency leave after a death in the family and was making the perilous night journey along with several other soldiers in a convoy of Humvees along the lonely desert roads from Ramadi to Baghdad. But something was wrong. The medic knew it as soon as the Humvee in front of her abruptly screeched to a stop close to midnight. Everyone began to worry what they were dealing with, an IED or an ambush from insurgents. When the team leader radioed to the other driver to confirm, he instead heard the last words he expected. Something flew in front of the Humvee. What followed was a scramble as the various soldiers in the Humvee convoy tried to get a visual on the mysterious object, and soon enough one of them did. A huge black figure in the road looking like a freakishly large bird. Except birds don't emit a shroud of blue-tinged smoke. When they tried to get a better look with night vision goggles, a rock the size of a human head was thrown at the front of the Humvee with incredible force. Everyone sat there for a moment in a state of shock before the mysterious figure in the road disappeared. When the team leader was satisfied that the threat was no longer active, they drove the rest of the way to Baghdad without incident. When they arrived, they spoke to a Marine who had been deployed far longer. As they told the story, there was a flicker of recognition in his eye. He claimed they must have encountered an Ifrit, a kind of winged jinn, an ancient and powerful Arabic demon associated with death and the underworld. At the time, the medic didn't make a big stink about it. Signs of mental unfitness were considered a career killer, but she never forgot what she saw, and what she saw also seemed to not forget her. She's experienced strange and inexplicable happenings in 2 different homes since the incident. Perhaps the Ifrit felt like using its smoky wings to take an American vacation. Speaking of America, let's take a trip south to discover one of the scariest and most mysterious stories on this list, one that might have you looking at even your closest friends and family members a little differently. The Mimics in the Jungle. This story first came out in 2020, early in the throes of the COVID-19 pandemic. An old ex-army commando from Peru was worrying about his health and the possibility that the virus might take him before he could share a terrifying story that had haunted him for almost 40 years. The monstrous and terrible things he discovered while marching in the jungle near Pucallpa. The commando operated a crack team of 18 men. It was one of the many groups deployed in the Peruvian jungle at the time to fight off political insurgents and members of drug cartels. As you can imagine from that description, they were a pretty tough group, and not the kind to scare easily. All that changed not during a fight, but a routine head count, where they found that there were 19 men in their unit, not 18. How was this possible? The commando tried to suppress his worry at first, assuming he had just miscounted. But no, he counted again and there were still 19 men in the unit. He gathered all of them for a closer look, only to find, with horror, that 2 of the men were exactly the same. The same face, same voice, same body, same uniform, and both of them claimed to be the real guy. Clearly, one of them was lying, and seeing as neither claimed to have a twin, it's likely that one of them wasn't human either. But the commando knew his men well. He asked a question that only the real one could answer, and when one of them got it wrong, he and the other men began shouting at it, causing it to flee into the nearby bush, where no body or no blood was found. Trying not to completely lose their mind over this, they just kept walking, until soon after the commando started to feel paranoid. He needed to do a head count again, just to be safe. Once again, there were 19 men in his unit, and it had happened again, just with a different member of the personnel now. They did the same song and dance again and kept on moving, but it kept happening again and again and again. The commando figured that by the time they exited the jungle, it had imitated every single one of them. Nothing like that ever happened again, but the commando couldn't help but wonder in the decades that followed, what was that thing? And what would have happened if they hadn't realized it was there with them? Sometimes paranormal threats to soldiers can appear when they're in the middle of intense combat scenarios, like preparing to enter firefights with cartel soldiers in the Peruvian jungle. Other times, the horror can follow you to the most unexpected places. The Devil in the Garden. Off to jolly old England, where you're about to hear a story that was anything but jolly. Our hero here is a British soldier who had some pretty hairy deployments, meaning he's not the kind of guy to run away from trouble. He'd seen active combat and always faced it head-on. But what he was about to face was somehow so much more frightening than that. When not deployed, he made his money as a gardener and a caretaker at a large manor house that functioned as a fancy bed and breakfast. It was an easy enough job despite the size of the grounds, and he had a good working relationship with the building's owners and customers that he ran into semi-frequently. The morning he had his paranormal experience, nothing seemed to be amiss. He did his duties as usual before taking a break for lunch in a more secluded part of the garden, listening to music on his headphones. But when he turned a corner, he was startled by something he didn't expect to see. A strange man standing right in front of one of his hedges, facing away, as though sticking his face straight into the hedge itself. He seemed to be an old man based on the back of his head. He wore an ill-fitting suit, his legs being a little too long for his pants. The soldier removed one of his earbuds to say something like, "Sorry, I didn't see you there." But then everything went dead silent. Everything. The ambient noise of the birds and the breeze and the cars on the distant motorway. Even the music coming out of his headphones. It was like sound itself had been stolen away. And then came the dread. It was a terrible, crushing dread, like nothing he'd ever experienced before. Not even during his most dangerous missions. It was a sense of what he could only describe as feeling a tremendous sense of evil coming from that man, and he knew in his heart that if he saw the man's face, something terrible would happen to him. He slowly backed away, keeping his eyes on the man for fear of what would happen if he looked away. He was able to escape the vicinity and then ran across the grounds until he found a few welders who were also working on the site. He told them what had happened, and they razzed him at first before seeing how clearly shaken he was. They agreed to follow him back to the place where he saw the strange man, getting a little more nervous the closer they got, until they were relieved to see that he wasn't there anymore. The sound had returned. That feeling of overwhelming evil had gone. To this day, he had no idea what he encountered in the garden, just that nothing before or since has ever made him feel like that. A ghost? A monster? The devil himself? He doesn't know, and all he can do is hope that he never finds out. Something like this is enough to make you want to take a relaxing holiday, but there is one place that you should probably avoid while you're there: the Whispering Workers. Back in the late 2000s, an American airman was stationed at the Osan Air Base in South Korea. In addition to all the standard rules and regs of Air Force life, everyone knew to observe one unwritten commandment as gospel: avoid the hardened aircraft shelter on Bravo Diamond. People operating quick response vehicles are told to hide in hardened shelters in the event of an attack, and they often did this during simulated attacks for safety practice. This was how people learned that there was something different about the one on Bravo Diamond. A group was said to have hunkered down there during one of the exercises when they sealed themselves inside and waited for around 90 minutes. It was the most eerie 90 minutes of any of their lives. They heard shuffling sounds in the pitch-black shelter around them, voices whispering, and some extra close to their ears, with one saying, "Please, no," in frightened, desperate tones. This lined up with the experience of basically everyone who'd sheltered there, and at this point everyone had decided to give it a wide berth. So what was so cursed about this one particular shelter? Nobody really knew, but one rumor that floated around the Osan Air Base was that it had once been the last refuge of a bunch of South Korean maintenance men when the area was taken by soldiers of the North. They had been captured inside the shelter, tortured, and then hanged with metal wires around their neck. If this had ever truly happened, then perhaps the tortured souls of the murdered workers are trapped there, in the dark to this day. And would you believe this still isn't the scariest paranormal military encounter coming out of Korea on this list? That grim horror goes to our next story, a grim prophecy. This was the account of a soldier based in the city of Uijeongbu, a little south of the DMZ, a rather tense location for anyone to be worried about a full-on war between the two Koreas. And that worry seemed to be becoming a terrifying reality for this soldier one night as he was standing on the airfield at night and saw that the skyline seemed to have burst into a chaotic inferno. It looked like the entire city of Uijeongbu was glowing a hellish orange as it burned. A war that would undoubtedly kill millions had begun. Naturally, the soldier panicked and dashed into the nearest office to alert his superior. She was stunned at the news that the North was supposedly invading, and he began rattling off a list of urgent actions until she asked him to take her to where he had seen the evidence of the attack. He led her outside in a frantic burst of energy only to see that the fire, the intense orange glow, was gone. All that remained was the starry skies and the glittering buildings of the Uijeongbu skyline. He thought that he was losing his mind, but he had no history of mental illness, no drug use, and despite being on the overnight shift, he wasn't sleep deprived. Truly nothing accounted for the terrible things he saw, except either a once-in-a-lifetime mental anomaly or some lapse in time that let him glimpse a terrible possible future. Now let's get back stateside for some more spooky tales. The thing inside the container. There's always been rumors surrounding Range 314, a patrol and marksmanship training section of the Camp Pendleton Marine Combat Training Center on the West Coast. Stories of tragic and paranormal events abounded there long before he ever had his own. There was the story of the Marine who took a rifle into a porta-potty and never came back out. The officers on site didn't want to remove his corpse and potentially freak out the other Marines in training, so they used a forklift to remove the entire porta-potty instead. The world's most undignified coffin. With a death that humiliating, it's probably not surprising that people on Firewatch have reported seeing the Marine's ghost wandering around the area, just as they have claimed to see a sniper with a Vietnam War-era uniform stalking around the firing ranges at night. But all of these paled in comparison to what Daniel Vu and a friend of his were about to experience one cold, dark night while standing guard around an airtight metal container full of weapons. It was supposed to work like this. One of them was meant to stay next to the container and stand guard, a job that Daniel's friend had agreed to. The other was meant to remain inside a nearby small Quonset hut. However, that's not how things went down, because Daniel got this strange feeling that he should not leave his friend alone. This friend had always been intuitive when it came to paranormal matters, so perhaps that was rubbing off on Daniel too. Not that long into their watch, something strange began to happen. They started hearing creaking sounds from inside of the container. The airtight steel container, with no way of anything alive getting in or out. The friend's intuition was telling him that something about this situation was unnatural, and in fact, it was only going to get worse. Soon the sound stopped inside the container, and instead it started to appear out in the world around them. Howling, scratching, creaking, kicking rocks, and yet there was nobody in sight. It was as though there was some kind of terrible force all around them. With seemingly no other recourse, Daniel started desperately reciting St. Michael's Prayer and taught it to his friend line by line. But even that didn't seem to subdue the terrible noises out there. Starting to get impatient, Daniel began picking up rocks and throwing them at the nearby hut, hoping it would alert the soldiers who were meant to come out and replace them on watch. Safety in numbers, after all. As Daniel threw a rock, completely missing the hut, they became aware of a terrible, inhuman screech in the dark, followed by an eerie whooshing sound like the beating of huge wings. Both Daniel and his friend saw it at the same time. It was an owl. No, it was a huge, inhuman shadow creature flying up from the ground and into the air with a scream that he was sure he'd remember for as long as he lived. They were stuck out there until 3 a.m., hearing those strange noises all around them, until their replacements eventually showed up to relieve them. Daniel couldn't rightly say what he and his friend had encountered that night, but he knew for certain that it was evil, and that it meant him and his friend the most terrible of harm. But you'd probably still rather take your chances with the thing from the steel container than spend the night in the tents at Fort Pickett. Being in the Army can take you to some truly frightening places, especially during wartime. But even when you're not in direct danger, the Army can still deliver terrifying experiences. This was the case for one female soldier during 2019 summer training at Fort Pickett, a place that wasn't exactly a picnic to go to even before things started getting all paranormal. For starters, it was infested with spiders, just like the offices here at the Infographics HQ. And if that wasn't enough, everyone in summer training was expected to spend the nights in tents scattered throughout the woods, the largest being the Army medical tent, with all the others lined up along the tree line behind it. It was in these very tents that what should have been the most restful part of the day instead descended into pure paranormal terror. For some, they would wake up in the middle of the night because something was shaking their tent. Sometimes, whatever was doing it would also whisper their names through the thin fabric. If it was some mean-spirited prank, nobody ever took credit. What couldn't have been a prank, however, was the incredibly vivid nightmares that plagued nearly everyone sleeping in the tents at Fort Pickett. Nightmares so intense and lifelike that sometimes, upon waking, you would realize you were still trapped within them. For our soldier, a sergeant, her scariest experience happened at 2 a.m. in a two-person tent with another sergeant who could corroborate everything that happened that night. They both awoke to hear footsteps. Hundreds and hundreds of footsteps outside, all circling like the entire population of the camp had gotten up and started marching around them in the middle of the night. Neither of them dared to look outside, on some level knowing that if they did, they'd encounter something they could never unsee. Have you ever served in the military and had an experience that science couldn't explain, just like any of the ones in this video? Sound off in the comments, and we might just use your thrilling paranormal tale in the next one of these. Now check out most terrifying military experiences with the paranormal to get the first half, or watch this instead.